Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this Tuesday dialogue with the amazing title, an exciting title, Limit to Infinite Error, Dealing with Migration Uncertainty. It's my very pleasure to welcome my colleague and friend Jakub Bijak to give the talk. Jakub is joint head of the Department of Social Statistics and Demography and professor of statistical demography at the University of Southampton in the United Kingdom. And at the same time, he's recently the coordinator of the EU-funded project Quantifying Migration Scenarios for Better Policies. And I would say he's really the expert on anything which deals with simulation methods and migration scenarios in Europe. My name is Andreas Edel. I'm the Executive Secretary of Population Europe. We are the network of 36 European institutes in the field of population studies with the aim to inform and discuss with stakeholders from policy, societal organizations and the economy about demographic issues. It's my very pleasure also to welcome you on behalf of the Förderfonds Wissenschaft in Berlin, which is a corporation of important funding organizations in higher education, science and research, and other partners from politics, societal organizations and business in Berlin. The Förderfonds provides support for projects in Berlin which have a high potential of scientific innovation and capacity building in the research area of Berlin. And I would also use that opportunity to express my gratitude to the Förderfonds for the financial support of the Tuesday Dialogue series, which already began 1.5 years ago and will continue until the end of this year at least. As you have seen in the invitation, it's called the Tuesday Dialogues for an Einstein Center for Population Diversity. Now, what is that about? A group of universities and research institutes in Berlin and around are planning to establish such an institute here in Berlin to discuss all matters of the growing population diversity, not only in Berlin and Germany, but also in Europe. So we are not only in terms of gender or other issues, but also aging, family, access to the labor market, education, and so on. So we have a growing diversity of our population, and we are particularly interested to understand how this affects and interacts with social inequality, particularly in the fields of health and family. So just for the background that you understand where we start from, and now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Jakub Bijak. Jakub, please.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I'm honored to be here and to take part in the Tuesday Dialogue series. So, as you might gather from the title of this talk, it will be about migration and migration uncertainty. And the problem with migration uncertainty in demography is such that migration is a process which, unlike other demographic processes, does not have a biological component to it. So one of the great demographers, Jim Voppel, who sadly passed away a couple of days ago, was making a strong point that demographic phenomena are better predictable than many other socioeconomic predictable, which is true, because mortality, fertility as well have strong biological components to them. Migration is the one piece of the puzzle when this doesn't quite work, when the uncertainty is really high, and where we need to take care of it in a specific way, just to make sure that we don't make any mistakes by avoiding the topic altogether. So as the talk, albeit virtually, takes place in Berlin, so I thought that having Brecht for an opening quote is apt. So that's from Life of Galileo. The aim of science is not to open the door to infinite wisdom, but to set some limit on infinite error. And the argument that I will be making throughout this talk, as you will see, is that actually, we in science, in social science especially, and talking about such difficult topics as migration, one of the easy mistakes to make is to be overconfident in what we can say about the current or even future state of affairs when it comes to such uncertain processes as migration. And of course, where we are today in terms of context is that yet again, unfortunately, very sadly, we have another war, another crisis related to with a migration component to it. The displacement from Ukraine, and in Ukraine in the first 5 weeks of war has been called, unprecedented. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees said that, this is the highest intensity since the Second World War, and also it's the crisis that definitely already now counts amongst the largest in terms of the absolute numbers of people affected. So we'll be using that context also, and I will be coming back to the Ukraine example just to connect to the three main themes of this talk, which will be, what can we know and how much do we know about the current migration processes as they unfold? Can migration ever be predicted, and to what extent? And could the responses, in this case, could the asylum responses be better? How can we learn from the past mistakes? So to start with, how much do we know about migration in general? And of course, we try to learn about migration from the data, but taking a step back, there is a general point I wanted to make, which is about the types of uncertainty that we are faced with when talking about the current and future migration. And you may remember Donald Rumsfeld, who was talking about the known and unknown unknowns, which is actually, despite the fact that this became a running joke among some of the commentators, this is a very valid point, and this is a point that I'd like to stress in the context of migration. There are some things that we can possibly learn about through better knowledge, but there are things that are beyond the reach, right? So the things that we can learn about include the data, the measures, the concepts, the drivers. We can build better models, perhaps, but there will be things that are beyond our reach in terms of prediction, and they include shocks. They include step changes in either the mechanisms or methods for gathering information, human behavior, and the fact that ultimately the future is open. So when it comes to data, the measurement depends on, of course, the mechanism through which we gather information. But even before that, it depends on the concepts, on the definitions that we are trying to apply when measuring, on the types of sources, on the accuracy and biases involved in gathering information, on the data quality, availability, and many other factors. So the bottom line is that when attempting to paint a picture even of current migration flows, we need to know what is being measured and how is being measured. So what you have on the slide is just an example of a piece of work from the Quantmic project that Andreas mentioned at the beginning, showing a flow involving a European country where we have some partial data for the first couple of years and then no data for the rest of the period. So you can see clearly how the uncertainty, how the error of measurement, once we try to model it in a coherent way, how it increases once the data are not available any longer. So this is just an example of the work done in Quantmic with huge thanks to Georgios Aristoteles, who is working on that piece of work. So turning to the current Ukraine crisis, what do we know? I mean, we know, everyone knows the headlines from the newspapers and television news. UNHCR has been reporting over 4 million people displaced outside of Ukraine in the first 5 weeks of the war. And if you look at the graph of the daily border crossings, they topped 200,000 persons a day in the early March. And you can clearly see some other spikes. The 13th of March, the bombing of Yavoriv near Lviv on that day that caused another spike of migration outflows. But these figures do not actually tell the full story, because what is being shown and what is being collected is just the information from about border crossings only for the neighboring countries. And these estimates, these numbers, exclude the fact that some of the people will not stay in the neighboring countries, they will move further onward into Europe. And they also crucially exclude return mobility, which we can probably, judging by the numbers from the border guard. So here you have a screenshot from a Polish border guard Twitter feed. We can probably put it about 15 to 20% of the inflows when it comes to people moving back to Ukraine. We will get a complete picture in due time, and this is something that will happen once people get registered in the countries of destination rather than just transit countries. But it will take weeks, if not months, given the sheer scale of the administrative challenge of registering everybody, giving everybody an identification number, access to government services and so on. And what is also important is that the legal mechanisms through which the registration takes place is different to what most refugee crises are dealing with. So in this case, we are not really talking about the Geneva Convention and the related processes, but this is largely driven by the European and local legislation under which the registration takes place. What do we know about the IDPs, the internally displaced persons in Ukraine? So we knew from the Ukrainian government registers that before the war started, there were about 1.5 million people internally displaced already. During the war, the International Organization for Migration carried out a survey with a fieldwork in the second week of March, and they estimated about 6.5 million IDPs across the country, of whom 13.5% had already been displaced before, so prior to the 24th of February. And this was a sample survey that was meant to be nationally representative and based on 2,000 respondents. So with a statistical error around 1%, but the problem in this case is that given the situation on the ground, it's quite likely that there's some bias in this measurement, and we don't quite know what the bias is. So what do we know, right? What can we measure? We can quite safely measure the order of magnitude. So we can be quite confident in stating that about 10 million people, both internally and internationally displaced from Ukraine, within Ukraine, which amounts to about a quarter of the pre-war population. We can make statements about the time patterns, especially for the international displacement, because that's where we get the information from the border crossings. We can say something about the routes. We can say something about the main demographic profiles. Also from the surveys, we can get information on intentions and barriers. And there is some experimental work going on trying to use social media and similar data also to gauge some information about the characteristics of the groups of people who are forced to flee the war. So we don't have the complete picture, and we will never be able to get a complete picture of the situation at an arbitrary temporal and spatial granularity, but at least we can say something with a high level of confidence. So now the question becomes, if there are limits to what we already know, what are the limits of predictability? Could migration have been predicted? And there is, in terms of the literature, this is something that was sparked in academic writings especially by the 2015-2016 so-called European migration crisis, after which quite a few papers, reports appeared dealing with the questions of migration forecasting. And what we know generally from the existing literature is that migration is something that's characterized by high levels of uncertainty, by high levels of complexity. Processes that we are talking about are not really well predictable. There are what we would call in statistical parlance non-stationary. And if someone tries to make predictions that look too precise and too orderly, that should raise suspicion. We also know that if we are trying to make any attempt at predicting, we should probably disaggregate the flows so that we are talking about individual flows or even individual sort of types of flows. So for example, asylum migration separate to labor migration, separate to family migration or return nationals. And amongst those, these flows will have different characteristics and also different levels of predictability. What we know is that some patterns, especially patterns by age, spatial patterns as well, will be relatively stable. The numbers of migrants, or the stocks in the technical parlance, will also be changing much more slowly than the events will. The key challenges that remain are how to describe the uncertainty, how to make sure that it's properly calibrated and it describes what we want it to describe, and also to move beyond that. So quite a lot of the current thinking is actually moving beyond uncertainty towards the areas of decision making and especially preparedness. So how to prepare for the unexpected. Why do we do that? Well, the answer will depend on the time horizon and on the purposes of making any statements about the future. So in the short term, during an asylum crisis, there is need for having crucially vital, timely information to aid the operational response. And this is where techniques such as early warnings and signal detection come in very handy. This is the very short term that we are talking about. In the midterm, we may want information to help us plan and prepare. And in the long term, we are talking about strategic policy decisions where we would apply techniques such as scenario setting, stress testing, horizon scanning, and similar. And the types of uncertainty that I mentioned at the beginning, so the epistemic, the one related to knowledge, the knowable and unknowns, and the aleatory one, the unknowable type of uncertainty, will have different predominance across different time horizons. So in the short term, it's the epistemic uncertainty that dominates. So we could improve our knowledge by having greater insight into what's going on now. Whereas the further we go into the future, the higher the role of the aleatory uncertainty becomes. And this is where the state of the art sits at the moment. So we can, in the very short time horizons, we can try to look at early warnings, just to try to see whether there is any signal that can presage changes, rapid changes in migration flows. We can also look at surveys. We can look at, in the slightly longer horizon, we can use traditional time series methods, and beyond that, we can use scenarios just to try to deal with the unexpected to the extent our imagination allows. And I did mention that different types of migration flows will have different levels of predictability, but at the same time, they will have different possible impacts on both of the people themselves, on the receiving societies, on the sending countries, and so on. So this is an attempt of mapping uncertainty versus such impact in a risk management type of framework that will be familiar to some of you from other applications, but that also is something that tells us about the reasonable expectations as to how far ahead we can think of predicting migration. So whether it's even sensible to think about predicting migration over long terms, mid-terms, or do we need to focus on the short or very short term, as in the case of asylum migration. So when we started looking at the possible warning signals, was there anything that could have predicted the crisis in Ukraine? there have been several leading indicators, as we would call them. So indicators that would indicate just with enough advance warning, perhaps a month or two, that something might be going on. So here is an example also from Quantum project, where my colleague Emily Barker is using some macroeconomic indicators, as well as information from the GDELT databases, the database that gathers information from the media around the world and uses artificial intelligence methods to assess the tone and to assess the importance and impact of different events that happen. So taken together, this has been trying to prepare early warnings based on the Eurostat asylum data from Ukraine, and doesn't involve the current crisis. So you will note that the time series ends in January 2022. But even then, we can see that there are, so the orange bars indicate the periods flagged by the early warning systems as periods of crisis that require attention. You know, this for the most of the period between 2014, between the start of the war in Crimea and Donbass and Luhansk, this is where the model would trigger some warnings as to the need for prepare better for a higher than expected numbers of asylum seekers. And of course, with respect to the current war, we had some leading information. Also, the governments had some leading information from intelligence briefs. So there were signals already in November that something is quite likely to happen, that the invasion is likely to take place. This is another information. It's not in the public domain, of course, but this is the information that the governments could possibly use in order to help them better plan and better prepare. The media scanning alone and looking at the tone of mentions that describe relationships between different countries, different actors is another piece of information that can be useful. And this is a work that was pioneered by colleagues from what was then European Asylum Support Office, now is the EU Agency for Asylum, who published a paper this year about forecasting asylum related to migration flows with machine learning and large data. So here is our example, focusing on the relationships between Ukraine and Russia, and you can see that that when the measure is carefully chosen, you can get some lead-in time, you can get some information about the situation deteriorating that can possibly trigger an asylum related challenge in the coming months. So if we know that, the question then becomes, could the responses have been better? You know, if we could predict, right, if we could have this a bit of a lead-in information, what could have been done? And here we are sort of moving beyond the question of predictability alone and come to the question of governance and the limitations of governance. So we are not talking about the problems with predictability, but we are more going into the area of problems with governance. So we know that predictions can be only made with errors, with very large errors in the case of migration. But this doesn't absolve the decision makers from being prepared and from making decisions. So this is the problem with the failure to act upon prediction, whatever the prediction may be. So this is just to use some common metaphors, right? The predictability problems are the black swan, right? This is Nicholas Taleb's animal metaphor for that. Whereas the failure of acting upon prediction is the gray rhino, something that is plainly seen but not attended to for whatever reason, for complacency or optimism bias. And in the case of Ukraine, could the response have been better? actually, I must say that many aspects of the response are just remarkable. The reaction of the individual people, the civil society, the charities, the many local governments, as well as some national governments across Europe, not all, I'm so sorry to say that, was actually helping manage the crisis in the first week to a very large extent. And this is crucial because given the pace of the crisis, of the events as it unfolded, the sheer numbers of people, that was probably the only way in which the responses could have been scaled up so quickly and so efficiently. And the political response at the EU level, the triggering of the Temporary Protection Directive on the 4th of March, giving refugees from Ukraine, no visa access, rights for stay, rights for participating in the labor market, access to education, and so on. This was also very, very, very quick. And it was followed up a couple of weeks later with operational guidelines that actually will become the first test of what was the 2020 EU Migration Preparedness and Crisis Management Network, the so-called blueprint that was adopted a year and a half ago. So was this all as good as it could have been? Well, there was some lead-in time for preparation. So the question now becomes, and this is something that will become a question that we'll be dealing with for the next few years. Was the time that we had, was the intelligence information that was available to the governments put to the best use, or was it the case of the optimism bias, whereby there was lack of belief that actually the invasion will take place and that we'll be dealing with such a massive scale displacement as hasn't been seen in Europe for many years. And of course, there are more challenges to come, right? One is the long-term durability of the temporary solutions that we now have in place, or the test of the resolve of the actors, which is basically saying that there's only so much and for so long that the volunteers and civil society can do, and the governments will have to step in with some systemic solutions. Likewise, the maintenance of the political will and the buy-in and the support from both the political circles and societies across Europe are quite crucial. But for the future, there's this situation really calls for having systemic solutions in place and also having civil contingencies framework in place for dealing with situations like this. So instead of a conclusion, I'll stop here and we'll be, just to have, so that we can have enough time for the dialogue. So going back to the quote from Brecht and the distinction between different types of uncertainty, what I wanted to say at the end of this introductory part of today's session is that even if we knew something within the limits of what we can actually know, even if we can shed some light on the current and possibly even on the future migration flows, what we need to do quite urgently is to learn how to live and how to cope with the infinite error that remains. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jakub, for this really very inspiring and exciting talk, also in terms of the overall considerations about how we deal with uncertainty and infinite errors, and on the other side also the insights into what exciting methods you apply to make this kind of work. And so many thanks for this really inspiring talk. So let me again tell you that when you would like to ask a question, then please write your name into the chat, because for some people this hand raise function of Zoom does not work. So please simply write your name into the chat, and then I will call you up according to what names pop up in the chat room. My colleague Mahalia just wrote you also that again in the chat. Yeah, let me perhaps asked the first question. We had, during the COVID-19 crisis, we had a similar event with Pearl Dijkstra, another great demographer from Amsterdam and from Rotterdam. And she was in this group of 7 scientific advisors of the president of the EU Commission, so really a very high-ranked policy advisory board. And actually her main message and learning from the COVID-19 crisis was, we as researchers should be more clear what we know, what we don't know, what we don't know yet, what we may never know. Because her feeling was that during that crisis, and already before that, we often made some best guess estimates, gave advice in a vague direction, and often then made ourselves, highly critical. So we could really be criticized for that purpose. And her advice was actually make clearer what you can say and what you cannot say, in order to build trust and then also to give good policy advice. That's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that when you talk to policymakers, it's often they need clear answers. They need they cannot work with uncertainties. They have to make decisions today and tomorrow. So there's a certain tension, I would say, between that. Just to give you a nice anecdote, a colleague from the US was once invited to the House of Representatives and was invited to provide evidence to the representatives, and he was also trying to make that clear. Okay, this we don't know exactly. So the colleagues from the representative from the House told him, okay, you don't know, why are you here? So you see, policymaking has a different kind of, let's say, evidence they know. So how can we deal with that? How can we deal with this tension? What we know, what is actually not to be known, and how can we give then best possible policy advice? What would be your advice from that?
I think we have to be honest, right? As scientists, as researchers, we have to be honest about the limitations of the knowledge we have. And the fact that the uncertainty is actually a feature of the world, right? It's nothing to do with someone not being an expert in the area, right? Part of the expertise is actually knowing your limits and not overstepping them. I think that's an important part of the mix. You mentioned COVID at the beginning, and actually, I think that given what we've been through with COVID, we are in a much better place when it comes to the public discourse about uncertainty, because this is something that we had to teach ourselves to live with for the 2 years of the pandemic. I mean, pandemic is not over yet, but the first 2 years were quite crucial in that respect. So I think that the making this explicit and also showing things to the decision makers that may bring this point home more clearly. So, for example, that when you look at migration flows, they do fluctuate a lot, even if there are no changes in the driver environment. Right? It's just a feature of the migration processes themselves. This is something that hopefully can bring the point home. And the next step is important. It's the fact that it's uncertain does not absolve us from giving the best evidence possible, because taking this uncertainty into account can also lead to better decisions, as long as we sort of change the thinking from trying to demand the impossible and trying to demand what the level of migration will be next year, for example, exactly, right, to something that's well within reach. So, which is how to plan for different contingencies. And and there are things that we can know, right? The trends, right, as they unfold in time. There are some patterns that we know. There are some, I don't know, age patterns, demographic distributions. But at the same time, migration is one of those processes that changes all the time. So with we would say in technical terms, there is no return to an old equilibrium after a shock, right? So if there is something that happens out of the ordinary, we can't expect the system that we're dealing with to return to where it was beforehand. It finds a new equilibrium and then another one. And that's how the dynamics of the process works. And this is something that making this point explicit and making this argument quite strongly, I think it's crucial, that we can't expect to be able to predict.
Mm.
There are bits and pieces that we can know. We can use them just to constrain our response, but it's the next step. It's the realm of possibility, and how do we respond in different situations that matters.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, it's exciting also to see how you solve this then very concretely when you talk about risk, when you talk about early alert. I would like to come back to that later, because we have our first question from the floor. And I apologize in advance to anyone if I should mispronounce with my heavy German English your name. So there's a question of Hao Dong Ki. Thank you very much for an interesting talk. I'm curious about the Eurostat asylum application data that you showed in one of your results. Is this data public available?
Yes. So there are lags in the Eurostat data, of course, but the work we are doing is entirely based on publicly available data. Because in a way, this is something that what we're trying to do here is that what kind of information is there available in the public domain that can be used for either predicting, or what the term is nowcasting, so trying to predict the present. And for that reason, we are using data from open sources such as Eurostat, also such as the GDAT database, which is very sort of up to date. So you can see basically yesterday's data on the database, which is another great feature of the many new data forms, mobile phone locators, social media data. The timeliness is second to none. Of course, you have to deal with in such situations. You have to understand the data. You need to know what the biases are involved, right? But it's going back to the general point about knowing your data and knowing the problems before making any inferences.
And do you see in that regard a special potential of social media data? Is that
I think in conjunction with other data sources, I think that's probably the crucial bit. I think we at the moment we know enough about the different types of data to be able to say that in isolation, new data sources, the big data, the mobile phone, social media data, will only be able to tell us as much. But when put together in a clever way with the more traditional sources, so registers, surveys, even border crossing data, the picture gets much more complete. So what we can borrow from the social media data is the timeliness, right? From other sources, we can get a better coverage, a better benchmarking to the whole population. So in this way, we can build a much more complete picture of what's going on. But that is something that requires a lot of work and a lot of thinking about what do the data actually tell us.
So is that a kind of a methodological pitfall which we should avoid in that regard, or what kind of pitfalls do you see in that research?
I think so. So I think that this is, the main pitfall I would see is overconfidence in any single method or any single source of data. So every method, has its limitations. Every source of data will have its limitations. And another pitfall is ignoring the context, and ignoring the context both in terms of the events that are happening, and in terms of the data and the data collection, and what do the data actually represent. So this is the case. This is the case of the current data on refugees from Ukraine, right? If we realize that what is being counted and what is being presented is actually one-way border crossings to neighboring countries added up, right? Then you can immediately see where the problems may be. That the data will be probably overestimated slightly because they don't take returns into account. That the distribution of destination countries will not be what it is because people move on further west in this case. So in terms of pitfalls, I would say overconfidence and ignoring the context would be probably the pitfalls to avoid.
Yeah, let me again encourage you to take the floor. Just write your name down in the chat room, and then you can make yourself visible and also to ask discuss directly with Jakub. As I don't see any question at this point in time, I take the freedom to ask another question, because you also mentioned that, I mean, crisis resilience is now the new buzzword everywhere. I mean, it's in research, it's in policy making. Of course, we had already a heavy crisis in the last 2 years. We had the migration crisis, we had the financial crisis. Now we have a political crisis, maybe even a war coming up, which affects more and more European countries directly. Who knows? I mean, so we are really in a situation of crisis. And how can we be better prepared? How can we better prepare for the next crisis, whatever it may be, in migration policies? I mean, if I understood you correctly, a lot can be done in early alert systems, and do more on the administrative level, getting prepared on that. What would be your advice? How can we become more resilient for the next crisis coming up?
I think it is a €1 million question, right? So I think part of it is what is. Some of it is happening already, which is really encouraging. That the bottom line is to have the legal framework in place, the operational framework in place, just to lay the foundations for appropriate response. So the fact that the EU triggered, for the first time ever, triggered the Temporary Protection Directive was so remarkable. The problem is that that this directive could have been triggered earlier on in other contexts as well, right? But for the first time after laying dormant for more than 2 decades, it got put to good use. Another thing would be to how to learn the lessons. I think that there's a bit of a tension here, because sort of learning lessons in the political context, when politicians are striving for being re-elected, learning lessons means admitting that we got something wrong, and sort of like we are exposing ourselves to criticism. But I think it's also what would be probably required here is a bit of a change of culture, because there are many areas where actually admitting to near misses and getting things not exactly right is quite crucial. So aviation industries is one such example where since they moved from the punitive culture of actually punishing pilots for the smallest mistakes, to actually letting pilots and crew members admit to mistakes and near misses with the aim of improving the processes and procedures and ultimately benefiting the safety of the passengers and crews. This was a huge step forward. So if this somehow could, this mindset, getting feedback on board, learning the lessons, being self-critical, not too critical, not overly critical, but being self-critical and not being punished for that, could somehow percolate into the public discourse, that would be wonderful. And another point is that avoiding the optimism bias is probably another thing that's quite visible in the run-up to the Russian invasion on Ukraine. It was visible in the sort of Western diplomatic circles. People really wanted to believe that Russia will not invade, despite as we learned later, quite strong indications to the contrary. So in a sense, we could hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And this preparation also, this is in the longer term. This cannot just be the volunteers and the civil society. I mean, this is something that will require systemic responses at different levels.
Yeah, thanks so much. So we have another 2 questions from the floor. The first question comes from Brianna. I guess it's Brianna Pirelli Harris. You can also ask your questions, by the way, yourself, if you just open your video and your mic, and otherwise I would read it. Brianna, would you prefer to do it yourself? Ah, here you are.
Hi. Yes, I was wondering about public opinion and how much you're taking that into account, because obviously we saw a backlash against the Syrian refugees in terms of public opinion in certain countries. And so are you expecting that also with the Ukrainian refugees? And yeah, what happens when the sympathy runs out?
It's a very good question, Brianna. And I think, to some extent, right? To some extent, when we're talking about the tone of reporting in the media, that will be reflected. The opinion polls are probably, the time granularity of the opinion polls will be smaller than what we can get from sources like GDEL. So there is a way of incorporating that into the analytical framework. How could this help with sort of preventing problems with integration, support, assimilation? It's an excellent question. This is something that I can imagine could be also used, the early warning framework especially, to look at early indications of things going wrong when it comes to the attitudes in the host countries. And if this is played right, if there are early indications, early signals that things start deteriorating, that may be a good time for intervention, but it all depends on the political will, right? So there is this crucial element that may or may not be present, and it's something that will be very difficult to overcome if it isn't. Right? So if there are vested interest in stoking the division and anti-immigrant sentiment at the political level, then there is a problem. But I think in principle, I can't see why similar tools could not be applied, at least to monitoring the situation.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's another question from the floor from Ms. Alejandra Rodriguez Sanchez. If you'd like to take the floor and to ask yourself, please do so.
Sure.
Yeah, please.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. Can you?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay, great.
Yeah, good.
So in addition to, I'm going to read my question. Thank you for your talk. And in addition for data-driven methods to predict migration flows, we can also think of sort of mechanisms that drive migration behavior. And among those, I'm thinking like social networks, of course, could be one of them. And I was wondering what role simulation models could play in making those predictions, or what role they play right now in the stuff that in the results that you share with us today, and what kind of simulations could someone like me who wants to work on this could do, like things like ABM or other kinds of simulation models.
Absolutely. Yes, I mean, thank you for that. And actually, it's a very, very timely question. I mean, I haven't talked about it in this presentation, but we have in parallel, we are concluding a 5-year piece of work that looks specifically at that. So the role of mechanisms in building more explanatory than predictive models of migration, but such models that nonetheless can give quite useful insights into the underpinning mechanics of the flows of the processes. So, if you are interested, there is a book that just come out in spring late last year, available as open access. So we'll be definitely happy to share the details if you're interested. But there is quite a lot of exactly the type of discussion that you mentioned in your question. We're looking at ABMs, agent-based models, but not on their own. They're embedded within a wider statistical framework for the analysis, and they also include elements from anthropology and cognitive psychology and computer science. So there is quite a lot of thinking at the moment about how to make the best use of the models and approaches that we have in the areas that you mentioned.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions from the floor? Last serve. Please send your name if you want to take the floor. No? Yeah, so then it was really a very exciting and inspiring discussion, and it's really thrilling. So the methods also use integrating this kind of analysis of news and other sources, social media data, other data, in order to go to better predictions. But particularly the openness and the let's say honesty, which we have learned and have to learn about, and also your claim that we should also make clear that there are limitations of any models which we present and predictions which we do. I think that's very striking, that we have to live more with these kind of limitations. And inside of that, we can do a lot by talking about risks, and that was, I think, very striking for me at least, that we should make the policymakers more clear. Okay, that's what we can say. Definitely, that's the case. But that is the risk. What would happen if you do this and this and this? And I think that would be, at least to my feeling, a good way to get out of this trap that policymakers need actually more clear information and answer. While we often have to say, well, we don't know, or we don't know perhaps in a couple of years, or we may never know. We can say, okay, we can help you estimating a risk, as any entrepreneur, for instance, also does when he makes a decision about whether to go to a market or with what project and so on, to use data, and then at the end of the day to make an assessment and a decision under risk and under uncertainty. And I guess we have to go more again back to that culture of uncertainty and risk. By the way, even in public administration, sometimes I have the feeling we should do that more, because very often we try to avoid any risk, and then we are more or less not able to act any sometimes. So also there, I think this culture of going with uncertainty, accepting risks, and making a decision under uncertainty and risk is perhaps really something we should work about. Is that something you take into consideration?
In a way, there's nothing wrong with admitting that the world is uncertain, right? As the software developers would say, it's a feature of the world, not a bug, right? It's just there for us to live with and deal with, and we can. What we do in science, in research, is we are trying to push the boundary. So we are trying to push the boundary of what is known, but there will be limits anyway, right? So that we will, at some point, we will reach a place where we will not be able to tell more meaningfully about what we are looking at, and this is just the way things are, and admitting that frankly, and just designing processes and changing culture in such a way that it supports dealing with the unknowns in a meaningful and constructive way is I think the way forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it was really. I'm really grateful for this debate today, and also for your inspiring insights into your research, and also these general reflections about where does research actually, and scientific advisory and scientific evidence-based policy advice, where should we go dealing with what we experienced in the last couple of years. Also for me, this was really a learning experience, I have to say. So thank you so much for your talk and for your contributions to the debate, also to the people who took the floor for the debate. So this was really very inspiring. So let me, sorry?
No, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Likewise. And let me perhaps just announce the next talk in this Tuesday dialogue series. On the 3rd of May, we will have a talk given by Jan Paul Heisig. He's a professor of sociology at the Freie Universität Berlin and head of a research group, Health and Social Inequality, at the Berlin Social Science Center, WZB. And this talk will go on 50 Shades of COVID, the uneven consequences of the pandemic and what we should learn from them. So as you see, it's also interesting in a few of what we learned today. With that, I would like to close today's Tuesday talk and thank again our speaker and thank again everyone who participated. I look forward to welcome you then next time, hopefully on the 5th of May. Take care and stay healthy, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.